Being alone is one of the cruelest tests of modern life, not because of the absence of others, but because of the inevitable presence of oneself. When silence replaces the noise of everyday life, when there is no one around to distract or validate us, something profound begins to emerge: a discomfort, an unease, a sense of emptiness that can no longer be ignored. But this emptiness is not new. It has always been there, buried beneath commitments, hurried relationships, and endless notifications. The truth is that loneliness reveals what we spend our lives trying to hide, the distance between who we are and who we pretend to be. And it is precisely in that space that anguish resides. It is not the lack of company that destroys us. It is the lack of connection with ourselves. Søren Kierkegaard, one of the greatest explorers of the human soul, saw this anguish not as emotional failure, but as a spiritual alarm, a call to authenticity. Loneliness is the mirror in which we are forced to confront the terrifying freedom of being ourselves and the weight of responsibility that comes with it. We flee from silence because it exposes us. It reveals how lost we still are from ourselves. On the other shore of this inner ocean, Arthur Schopenhauer offers a radically different, yet complementary perspective. He does not fear solitude, he celebrates it. For Schopenhauer, the ability to be alone is not a weakness, but a mark of greatness. It is the sign of a mind that does not depend on external noise to feel alive. Solitude, for him, is the refuge of elevated spirits, those who are not content with the mediocrity of distraction, who have found a home and a fortress within themselves. This video is an invitation to walk between these two shores, between the emptiness of loneliness and the fullness of solitude, between fleeing from yourself and the courage to finally inhabit yourself. Because what you feel, this silent discomfort, this ache that has no name, is not a mistake. It is a sign, an urgent request for you to stop running, stop losing yourself in others, and finally begin returning home, to within. I do not offer easy consolation. I offer clarity, a direct, unmasked look at what it means to be alone and how this experience, when understood, can become the most liberating of your life. If you've made it this far, it's because something in you is tired of fleeing, and perhaps, just perhaps, you are ready for the truth. The emptiness you feel is not loneliness. It is longing for yourself. And so we arrive at one of the most painful realizations of the human condition, that we are always, in some fundamental way, alone. Not just physically, but spiritually, existentially. Even in the arms of another, even in the warmth of a crowded room, there exists a subtle barrier between us and the world, a translucent veil that prevents full communion. Kierkegaard called this the sickness unto death, not just the fear of dying, but the fear of never truly being seen. It is a despair that arises not from being unwanted by others, but from being unreachable, by them, and even by ourselves. Schopenhauer believed this loneliness was a direct result of our intellect. Animals, he said, do not suffer from isolation, because they live moment to moment, unconcerned with the future, free from metaphysical reflection. But humans, burdened with memory, fantasy, and imagination, are condemned to experience their separation from the world. We look out into a world we can never fully join, because we are forever trapped within ourselves. Every man takes the limits of his own field of vision for the limits of the world, he wrote. And this blindness to our own isolation makes us feel more alone, not less. But there is a paradox at the heart of this truth. Because while loneliness is a kind of wound, it is also the birthplace of freedom. Kierkegaard argued that the self is only born in despair, that without first confronting the emptiness of existence, we cannot find a self that is truly our own. It is through the dark night of the soul that we stop performing, stop pleasing, stop hiding behind social masks, and finally face ourselves, raw and trembling. This confrontation with nothingness is terrifying, but it is also where transformation begins. Solitude, then, is not the same as isolation. Isolation is being cut off. Solitude is choosing to face yourself. It is not a prison, but a monastery, a place where the soul, stripped of distraction, hears its own voice for the first time. Schopenhauer knew this. He lived in deliberate solitude, walking alone, reading voraciously, thinking deeply. He was not loved widely, but he learned to love the clarity that silence brings. A man can be himself only so long as he is alone, he said. If he does not love solitude, he will not love freedom. For it is only when he is alone that he is really free. Freedom from what? From the opinions of others, from the need to be admired, from the constant erosion of identity that comes from endless social comparison. In solitude, we discover that our value does not come from the gaze of the crowd, but from the depth of our own being. We begin to realize that meaning is not something given to us by the world. It is something we create in response to its silence. And yet, the silence is unbearable for many. That's why people distract themselves endlessly, with noise, with stimulation, with validation. The modern world is built on avoiding solitude. Social media, entertainment, the cult of productivity, these are the anesthetics we use to numb the pain of aloneness. But Kierkegaard warned that the more we flee from solitude, the more we deepen our despair. Because in avoiding ourselves, we become strangers to the one person we must never lose, the self. This is why the greatest philosophers, mystics, and artists have always retreated into solitude. Not because they hated the world, but because they needed to see it more clearly. Solitude gives birth to vision. In silence, we encounter what Jung called the shadow, the repressed, ignored, disowned parts of ourselves. And by facing the shadow, we become whole. But this process is not easy. When you begin to sit in your own silence, demons arise, memories you buried, regrets you denied, needs you refused to acknowledge. The initial phase of solitude is always painful, because it reveals how deeply we've betrayed ourselves in order to be liked, accepted, included. This is the real source of our loneliness, not that others don't see us, but that we have stopped seeing ourselves. Kierkegaard described this as the despair of weakness, when we become so afraid of rejection that we refuse to be ourselves at all. We live according to the expectations of the herd, not the stirrings of our soul. We smile when we want to scream. We agree when we want to protest. We conform, not because we believe, but because we are afraid to be alone. And in doing so, we create a self that is hollow, a self that slowly dies. To choose solitude, then, is to choose resurrection. It is the decision to walk away from the false self and face the terrible freedom of being real. And once you begin this journey, something strange happens. You start to find peace. Not happiness, not ecstasy, but peace. The stillness that comes, from no longer lying to yourself. The quiet pride of knowing that you have stopped running, that you have stood still long enough to meet your own soul. This peace is not visible to others. It won't win you applause, but it gives you an inner life. And this inner life becomes your refuge when the world fails you, as it inevitably will. Friends will leave, lovers will betray, status will fade, health will decline, but the soul you have built in solitude will endure. It will speak to you in the darkness. It will hold you when no one else will. This, Schopenhauer believed, was the path of wisdom. To turn inward, to live in accordance with your nature, to prefer truth over comfort. A man who does not enjoy solitude, he wrote, will never learn to live. Because to live, truly live, is to see through the illusions of society and return to the essence of being. And that essence is simple. It is silence. It is attention. It is presence. Kierkegaard agreed. For him, the self was not a static identity, but a dynamic relationship, a relationship between the finite and the infinite, the temporal and the eternal. And the only way to discover this self was to stand alone before God, naked and trembling. This moment, he said, is the true test of the soul. Will you collapse into despair? Or will you take the leap into faith, into freedom, into authenticity? The modern world does not prepare us for this leap. It prepares us to consume, to conform, to compete. It prepares us to be useful, but not to be whole. And so, loneliness has become an epidemic, not just because people are physically isolated, but because they are spiritually unmoored. They have not learned to sit with themselves. They have not been taught that solitude is sacred. But you can learn. You can begin today to reclaim your aloneness, not as a curse, but as a calling. Sit in silence for 10 minutes. Turn off your phone. Listen to your breath. Notice your thoughts. Don't judge them, just observe. This is the beginning of reconnection, the beginning of intimacy with yourself. You may be surprised by what you find. A buried longing, a forgotten dream, a still, small voice that says, "This is who you really are." Follow that voice. Feed it. Let it grow. And in time, you will find that solitude is not loneliness. It is a deep, resonant companionship with your own soul. It is the realization that you are never truly alone, because you are always with yourself. And if you can learn to love that self, then you will carry a home inside you that no one can take away. Kierkegaard and Schopenhauer were not trying to romanticize suffering. They were trying to wake us up, to show us that pain is not an enemy, but a doorway, that loneliness is not a punishment, but a teacher, and that in choosing to walk the lonely path, we may discover a freedom deeper than any offered by the world. So if you feel alone, if the silence scares you, if you wonder whether anyone will ever truly understand you, know this: you are not broken. You are being called back to yourself, called to rediscover the soul the world made you forget. Don't run from that call. Embrace it. Walk into the silence. Let it strip you of illusion. Let it purify you. Let it show you who you really are. But what happens when solitude is not chosen but imposed? What happens when the silence becomes suffocating, not liberating? This is the other face of loneliness, the one Kierkegaard feared when he wrote of the sickness unto death, the despair that arises not from being alone but from being estranged from oneself. Inauthenticity, in his view, is a greater agony than any physical isolation. It is when we become so lost in the masks we wear for others that we forget who we truly are underneath. The crowd, for Kierkegaard, is the untruth. He warns us that losing ourselves in social roles, in appearances, in empty chatter, may stave off the sting of loneliness temporarily, but it replaces it with something far worse: spiritual disintegration. To be in despair is to be divided, alienated not only from others, but from the very ground of one's existence. Schopenhauer, too, saw this falsity. He detested the noise and distraction of the world, not because he was antisocial, but because he saw it as a denial of the depth of human suffering. Noise is the most impertinent of all forms of interruption, he once wrote, because it interrupts the train of thought. And what is thought, if not the very site where the self must face its truths? In solitude, the thinker is stripped of his comforts and illusions. He is forced to reckon with the fact that life contains more pain than pleasure, more longing than fulfillment. But in this reckoning lies something sacred. When the world is stripped away, when no one is watching, a person begins to see who they really are and what they truly want. Yet this process is not linear. It comes with grief. There is a kind of mourning that emerges in solitude, not just the mourning of people lost or relationships ended, but the mourning of versions of the self that no longer serve. Kierkegaard called this the leap of faith, the terrifying act of shedding an identity built to please others, to be liked, accepted, or understood. One must leap into the unknown, into the absurd without guarantees. And that leap often begins in silence. It begins when a person finally says, "I am no longer going to betray myself to be loved." This is the beginning of self-respect. Schopenhauer, despite his pessimism, hinted at a subtle dignity in the person who does not demand that life give them meaning, but who instead chooses to bear its weight with integrity, one who withdraws from worldly desires not out of bitterness, but because they have seen through the illusion. To desire, he said, is to suffer. and to free oneself from constant craving is to find, paradoxically, peace in renunciation. Kierkegaard did not renounce desire in the same way, but he saw the necessity of suffering for growth. In The Concept of Anxiety, he explained how anxiety is not merely a disorder, but a teacher. It is the dizziness of freedom, the moment before we become something new. Anxiety reveals to us that we are more than what we have been. But it also terrifies us because becoming new means dying to the old. And we mourn what we leave behind, even if it was never truly ours. In solitude, this mourning becomes visible. The silence acts as a mirror, reflecting the ghosts we carry, the parent we tried to impress, the lover who left, the ambitions we chased for the wrong reasons. Loneliness forces us to confront not just the absence of others, but the parts of ourselves we abandoned in pursuit of belonging. And in this confrontation, something else is born: honesty. Honesty is the bedrock of true self, connection. It is not glamorous. It often looks like tears at midnight, like empty notebooks filled with confused thoughts, like long walks with no destination. But it is sacred. It is the beginning of authenticity. Kierkegaard called this becoming a self, a task that takes a lifetime. It cannot be rushed. It cannot be faked. And most of all, it cannot be done in the noise of the crowd. Schopenhauer, though darker in tone, agreed in essence. His metaphysical pessimism, the belief that suffering is baked into the fabric of reality, was not an invitation to despair, but a challenge to rise above illusions, to stop expecting happiness as a right and instead cultivate character, clarity, and compassion for all beings caught in the same struggle. For him, the solitary philosopher was not a cynic, but a realist, one who sees suffering clearly and still chooses to live with grace. But grace is not given. It is forged, in silence, in struggle, in the moments when the loneliness becomes unbearable, and yet we refuse to run. It is in these moments that the human spirit reveals its depth. Kierkegaard saw in Abraham, the father of faith, not a saint immune to doubt, but a man willing to walk alone, to trust a higher voice within even when it made no sense. That is what loneliness demands of us. Faith, not necessarily in God, but in the unseen value of our own existence. And so we must ask, what if our loneliness is not a curse, but a calling? What if the ache we feel in our chests is not a signal to escape, but a signpost guiding us back to ourselves? We are, all of us, exiles in a noisy world. We are asked to be constantly connected, constantly available, constantly performing. But deep down, we know this is not where meaning lives. Meaning arises in the quiet hours, in the honest reflections, in the refusal to betray what feels true. Solitude, then, is not loneliness's enemy, it is its fulfillment. Loneliness is the cry, solitude is the answer. One is pain, the other is peace. And yet, they are made of the same material. To move from one to the other requires courage. It requires that we stop waiting to be rescued and instead become the person who does the rescuing from within. This is the philosophical core of both Kierkegaard and Schopenhauer, the idea that the soul must suffer in order to see, and that what it sees in silence can redeem it, not in a religious sense necessarily, but in the sense that redemption means return to the self, to truth, to being. In this way, the pain of being alone is not something to avoid, but something to honor. It is the sign that you are awake, that you are no longer willing to be anesthetized by the shallow comforts of the crowd, that you are seeking something deeper, something real, and in seeking it, you begin to become it.